boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, bap, bap.
Hi, I'm Nyesha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Hi, my name is Darrell Fitzgerald Jr., and welcome to my show, The Truth Hurts, the show where we explore the essential truth of a matter. Today's topic for our show will be violence. Violence in the state of Connecticut and violence in the United States of America. I have a special guest today on the show who is very much aware and has a lot of wonderful statistical and data information about violence. Her name is Lisa Rose Rodriguez, and she is an epidemiologist. Lisa, can you please introduce yourself to our viewing audience?
Certainly, Darrell. Thank you for having me. And I enjoy listening to your intro because the truth does hurt. And we're going to talk about some very serious truths this morning. An epidemiologist, for your viewers, is someone who understands and cures diseases and populations. And I got my training at the University of Connecticut Health Center in Farmington. And in that program, we are taught and trained that violence is an illness. It's a societal ill.
Mm-hmm. Just also want to state for the audience a brief disclaimer. Our hope in this show is to analyze the research and data and come up with some useful suggestions of how society on a whole can live law-abiding and peaceably. I'm hoping through education and knowing the symptomatic root causes of violence, we as individuals in society can implement best practices to break the cycle of violence. Lisa, would you describe violence in America as an epidemic?
I certainly would. When you take a look at the statistics that are available, for instance, for the last 50 years, you will see an escalation in the number of violent acts that result in homicide. In Connecticut in 1962, there were 34 reported homicides. 50 years later, and these are the latest statistics because it takes a while, obviously, to compile things. The latest statistics say in 2012, there were 146 murders. So that's an escalation. That is a fourfold escalation. So I'm sure your viewers are wondering, what are some of the reasons for this, obviously. But yes, the society continues to get violence, and it's a complicated question because there are so many factors. It's not a linear answer, nor is it a linear question, Darrell.
Well, I appreciate your answer. I know you and I, from time to time, we have conversations about different topics, and we've had some candid conversations about violence. One thing you had shared with me that was kind of startling, and it was probably the reason why I wanted you to come on the show, was you mentioned to me a specific statistic. And that statistic was that the leading cause of violence for women in the workplace was homicide.
Yes.
And that was a statistic I had never heard of before. I had never heard it reported in regular media or mass media. And initially, I started to make me think that, well, what is the actual causes of these type of violence? I mean, who would tend to think that the leading cause of violence for women in the workplace is homicide? So I'm wondering, well, what is the nature of this type of violence? How are women being murdered in the workplace? And who are these perpetrators of this type of violence against women?
All right, so let's start with the last one. Who are the perpetrators? 49.4% of workplace attacks on women come from friends or relatives or acquaintances. Mm-hmm. The language that I also like to use is that of a conjugal partner, someone that you may have an intimate personal relationship with, have had children with, dated, etc. So 49.4% of those women who are attacked at work are attacked by these people. Conversely, only 30.3% of conjugal partners or intimate partners or acquaintances attack men at work. Most men who die at work die truly from the occupational hazards that work presents. For instance, the men who install air conditioning vents have suffocation deaths because their oxygen runs out. All of us have watched the news, and we have seen a story where 4 or 5 construction workers fall off of a scaffolding and die. But you've never seen 4 or 5 pregnant women falling off a scaffolding and dying. So interpersonal violence results in deaths for women at the workplace more than men. So it's a very alarming statistic. Many people, when I first started addressing this issue, it was at a University of Connecticut women's annual meeting, and many people in the room assumed that most women who die at work actually would have succumbed to a heart attack, and that's really not true. So violence is the #1 cause of death for women at work.
Is that statistic high because there are probably a lot of mass shootings in educational environments, at schools? Does that drive the number high?
Well, that's an interesting question. Mass murderers. Well, let's talk about Newtown because that is the anniversary is coming up. And Newtown is interesting in that it fits many of the statistic profiles. Most of the victims at work were female. But the difference is they are not known, the perpetrator is not known to them. He does not have an intimate or personal relationship with them. All right. Initially, it was reported that his mother was working at the school, and people thought, the initial reports, they thought that she was one of the teachers that was victimized at the school. But this fits some of the pattern. The mass shootings don't fit the interpersonal violence pattern, to answer your question, because the victims are truly random. And I'll remind your listeners, random means equal probability of all or none. So the personal piece is missing. The mass shooter is not interested in revenge. He's not interested in eliminating child support payments, which is what the Hartford Courant is reporting about a recent triple homicide in Manchester, that the perpetrator became violent after he received notification of child support. So all of these things have to be in place for something to be defined interpersonally versus randomly.
So then the majority of the homicides of women at the workplace is because of a person who's in an intimate relationship, a spouse, a boyfriend,
Yes.
actually coming to the place of work
Yes.
and committing an act of violence.
Yes, that's what it
Now, is there a percentage that of those type of homicides that come from, let's say, rage at the workplace, or let's say actually a victimization from management?
Yes, and here in Connecticut, the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, when Darrell was governor, produced a report specifically for recognizing workplace violence. This came as a result of the lottery shooting years ago. So yes, there is that in place. But to answer what I believe is your question, women are always overrepresented in workplace deaths when it comes to homicide.
Oh. You don't mind if I just ask you a few other questions as it relates to violence? I developed a few questions.
Certainly.
I'd like to ask you. I just want to know, is there any correlation between the perpetrators of violent gun crime and consistent play of violent video games?
The data on that is actually mixed. Many people who are watching this who are familiar with Newtown, there was a lot of information out there, social media, mainstream media, that stated that that perpetrator, that murderer, was very much into video games. The Columbine shooters, maybe even the medical student in Aurora. The information is mixed, because what most people feel is that only a certain group of people will cross a barrier between fiction and reality and decide to live out the shooting games in the real world. So that is why it is mixed. Other people, when you do research on this, are concerned about the normalization of violence and the number of images that are violent in our society. When you go to the movie theater next time, look to see how many of the posters contain someone holding a gun. And then if you compare that to with, like, for instance, European films that come, you will see that their stories are not, they're not action stories, most of those movies. They're stories about people's relationships and things like that. So there are people who are saying that the society as a whole is more violent, and it's not just the video games, or then that the video games represent the society as being more acceptable. When you and I were teenagers, we could play Pac-Man, and there is no violence in Pac-Man. So if you go to the video game store now, there are gradients of violence. It's very hard to find a game that's not a shooting game. Okay?
I know you made a mention to mass shootings, and we've been really inundated with a lot of mass shootings, particularly at schools in this country. Does the research or the data show what is the primary motive of a lot of these individuals who are the perpetrators of these type of violent crimes, these mass shootings at educational institutions?
Well, educational institutions are vulnerable, first of all, but the mindset of a mass shooter is that he or she, they want to take out as many people as possible. So this is why it happens at a mall, for instance. The data is not good on understanding exactly who the mass shooters are. For instance, there's a difference for instance, some people are spree killers. A spree killer has an event that triggers something emotionally. For instance, a spree killer may kill his spouse or wife or someone at work, and then in his attempt to escape, then he shoots the policeman or he shoots someone for a car. A spree killer is different. So understanding who the mass murderers are, the society does need to get better at identifying them. People want them to have a motivation, but in a logical sense, can you really have a motivation for something so horrific? They have convoluted logic that they use, but I don't think it's fair for those of us who are trying to understand it to try to rationalize in any way. I think the prevention is over someone being able to have those thoughts and obtain the weapons. Mm-hmm. Yes. Do
the shooters of a lot of these mass shootings, the perpetrators of these mass shootings, do you find that in their motive that they have connections with any particular ideology or organizational ties?
So far, the ones that I'm familiar with don't. Again, they've created a scenario in their convoluted logic where they must act it out, and it has to end with people dying. So, and those people who do claim ideology for certain events do so in such a way that we're very clear about it. The Aurora shooter had no ideology that he claimed. The Newtown shooter had no ideology that he claimed as well.
Okay. I have another question. Does the evidence suggest that there are primary societal factors that spike a rise in gun violence or plays a major influence as a cause or correlator of gun violence? Like, when do we usually see the number of, is there any societal factor that influences the number of homicides in a particular time or in a particular year? Does economics play a role?
That's a very good question. Many people who are looking at the United States versus other countries are looking at homogeneity. So America is not homogeneic in any way, sense, or form. That's one thing that people are looking at. Another thing people are looking at, if we look at black on black homicide and the Latino male homicide rate here in Hartford, they're also looking at high school dropout rates. There is definitely a correlation between high school dropout rates and becoming the victim or the victimizer in interpersonal violence. Another thing that people are looking at, Darrell, is the way that certain groups of people have grown up in a society that's fractured and have seen people solve problems using violence. So the people who are looking at that say, if you see your mother beaten up by her boyfriend, and then you become a victim of corporal punishment yourself, you believe that you solve conflicts through violence. So as you get older and you get more access to weapons, then a knife, a gun, and a baseball bat become a way you resolve conflict.
So actually lack of education and high school dropout rate or literacy are factors that lead to people committing,
Yes.
violent crime.
Yes.
That's interesting. So in terms of approaching education, our approach to education could actually help in the process of preventing violent crime. You know, I really appreciate you being on the show, Lisa. We just kind of like scratched the surface, you know,
Certainly,
in our
Darrell.
discussion. And I hope that I can have you as a guest on a future show and we can explore some more issues and topics as it relates to violence. I really thank you for your expertise and being on the show, The Truth Hurts.
Thanks for having me, Darrell. And if you have viewers who are interested in, you know, finding out what some of the triggers are, they should contact domestic violence resources in their neighborhoods.
I want to thank all our viewers for tuning in on this episode of The Truth Hurts with Darrell W. Fitzgerald Jr. If you're interested in actually being on the show, you can contact me at 860-922-6983. Thank you for viewing.